Coyne, Chapter 8 through 9. What about us? Raymond Arthur Dart was an Australian anatomist and anthropologist who in 1924 discovered the first ever fossil of Australopithecus africanus. He discovered a fossilized brain in a box of rocks that was given to him in the middle of a wedding. The discovery of Australopithecus africanus showed that the gulf had indeed been crossed by our ancestors, as it once was predicted by Charles Darwin. Australopithecus africanus was a link that was closely related to humans. Evidence to support the linkage between humans and apes is presented through genetics and paleoanthropology. DNA is analyzed and fossils are dated to determine where we belong in the evolutionary tree. But even if evidence supporting evolution is discovered, some people will refuse to believe. Some people are reluctant to believe that our common ancestors are chimpanzees and gorillas because they seem to think that this idea somehow diminishes our humanity. Instead, they protest to keep evolution out of schools and continue to believe that humans are somehow special. Creationists and evolutionists have different ideas in how the earth was formed and how humans came to be. Simply put, creationists date the earth to be a few thousand years old and believe that a god created humans from dust and a rib. But evolutionists believe in evidence like rock layers, bones, and radiation to help determine the approximate age of the earth and humanity. Michael Brunet, a French paleontologist, discovered the skull of a late hominid nicknamed Toumai. The skull gave hints on the hominid's posture. Looking at the base of the skull showed that the hole where the spine would connect was closer to the front, in comparison to that of a primate. This suggested that Toumai walked on two legs.
An American paleoanthropologist, Donald Johnson, stumbled upon bones of a single individual while looking for fossils in Ethiopia in 1974. He had come across the bones of a single individual who was later named Lucy. These findings dated back to 3.2 million years. Johansson's discovery, Lucy, had a very ape-like head with a chimp-sized brain case. Her skull showed more human-like traces also. She had signs of semi-parabolic tooth and reduced canine teeth. Her arms were longer than modern humans but shorter than chimps. Her finger bones were curved like those of apes. Some scientists believe that our upright posture evolved long before our big brains. How can we tell Lucy walked on two legs? From the way the femur is connected to the pelvis at one end and to the knee at its other. In a walking primate like ourselves, the femurs angle in towards each other from the hips so that the center of gravity stays in one place while walking, allowing an efficient bipedal stride. Another team of paleoanthropologists led by Mary Leakey confirmed the bipedality of afarensis with another find in Tanzania. The famous Lautoli footprints are an 80-foot trail made by two hominids who had clearly been walking on two legs. We know this because there was no impression of their knuckles made on the floor. They were walking during an ash storm which was followed by a lot of rain, which helped turn the ash into cement-like layers that was later sealed in by another layer of dry ash, preserving the footprints. The feet were almost certainly the right size and dated back to 3.6 million years ago. After afarensis, the fossil record does get a little more confusing. The records show more progression to a modern human form. Tooth row gets more parabolic, the brain gets larger, and the skeleton loses its ape-like features. 2 million years ago, the borderline between the fossils placed in the genus Australopithecus and those placed in the more modern genus Homo was distinguished. Whether a fossil called one name or another depends on whether it has a larger or smaller brain. For example, a larger brain would be Homo, and a smaller brain would be Australopithecus. Another great step forward in human evolution was their ability to make and use tools. Homo habilis was the first tool using human. Remains first appeared 2.5 million years ago, used a variety of tools used for cutting, scraping, and butchering. Homo erectus, also known as upright man, holds the distinction of being the first hominin to leave Africa. Remains have been found in China, Indonesia, and the Middle East. Their skeletons were also nearly identical to ours. They had tools that were complex, like stone axes and scrapers, with intricate flaking. They were also the first species to control fire. We know this because scientists found erectus remains alongside burned bones. Homo heidelbergensis first appeared 500,000 years ago. This species had a mixture of features of modern humans and Homo erectus. Neanderthals show up a bit later, about 230,000 years ago, and lived all over Europe and the Middle East. They had large brains, even bigger than those of modern humans, and were excellent tool makers, as well as great hunters. About 28,000 years ago, the Neanderthal fossils vanished. So what happened? There are two theories, which states that Homo erectus simply evolved into Homo sapiens independently in several areas, because maybe natural selection was acting the same way all over Asia, Europe, and Africa. The second theory is the out of Africa theory, which proposes that modern Homo sapiens originated in Africa and spread, physically replacing Homo erectus and the Neanderthals by either outcompeting them for food or killing them. Looking back at all the evidence collected, the evidence is clear. Complex adaptation occurred for us humans to get to where and what we are now. Adaptations like erect posture, remodeled skulls, larger brains, and smaller teeth. Natural selection was involved in the adaptations made in humans, but we don't know why. However, between 10 to 3 million years ago, a drought in East and Central Africa may have led scientists to believe that bipedality originated during this time period. Climate change towards a warmer climate may have been the reason many biologists feel that these changes in climate and environmental had something to do with the evolution of bipedality. Bipedality allowed for hands to be free and gather food while walking. Walking under our legs allowed for less surface area for the sun to beam down on them and allowed them to walk longer.
Humanist genes are important to biologists because they dictate the differences from our closest ancestors, the chimps. Looking at results that were made in a study back in 1975 by Alan Wilson and Mary Claire King, the results say that protein sequences from human and chimps differ by only 1%. And recent work has not changed this number because it has only risen to about 1.5%. This 1% showed that there are a good amount of genes that are similar between humans and chimps. It was thought that because the changes were small, therefore humanist genes were dictated by a few key mutations. New work shows that our similarities were not as minute as we thought. 1.5 difference is actually bigger than we expect it to be, especially when dealing with our genetic code. For example, if we take proteins, we know that they are composed of hundreds of amino acids. 1.5% difference in 100 amino acids, we can see about one difference, whereas in several hundred amino acids, we will see more differences, up to 4 differences or more. Therefore, 1.5% difference is larger than it seems. These differences cause big changes because amino acids are the building blocks that make up the proteins in our body. They're essential for our form and function. So we can see that more than 80% of the proteins that are shared by chimps and humans have differences in at least one amino acid. Our genome has around 25,000 protein-making genes, therefore 20,000 genes have differences. This is expected because visually we can see differences between us, and that only means that more than one gene is responsible for the differences. So we know that there are differences, but to what extent? There are different types of differences. There's differences in sequence of genes, like we've seen. There are differences in the presence of genes. More than 6% of genes found in humans are not found in chimps. There are over 1,400 novel genes. that are expressed in humans and not in chimps. And that's not it. There's more differences. We also differ in the number of copies of many genes that we do share. The gene that codes for the salivary enzyme in the mouth that breaks down starch into digestible sugars, chimps only have one copy of this gene, whereas humans have 2 and 16 copies of the gene, giving an average of 6 copies. Therefore, natural selection was most likely responsible because our ancestors' diet was more starch based, like as plants, than carbohydrates. In humans, in the form of fruits, or even nowadays we have a lot of sugars in our diet. And to bring it all home, we know that genetic divergence comes from several differences. Changes in the proteins produced by different genes, presence or absence of genes, number of gene copies, when and where genes are expressed during development. Therefore, the take home message is humanness is not because of one type of mutation or changes in only a few key mutations, but rather by several types of differences on genes caused by a lot of genetic change. This is obvious because there are many differences between us, like anatomy, physiology, behavior, language, and brain size. But what genes make humans humans? Currently, there is not much to say about this because researchers are still trying to find genes that point to exact answers. By comparing entire DNA sequences of chimps and humans, we can find classes of genes that have evolved in the human genome. Some of these genes are involved in the immune system, gamete formation, sensory perception, and nerve formation. Although we still cannot point out what genes show this exactly, there are a few candidate genes. For example, there is the FOXP2, which is thought that has evolved to give rise to human speech. What about race? Before we get into this, we must note that when talking about race, we have to be very careful because it is often related to racism. Scientists try to stay away from it as much as they can, and they claim that race is a social political construct. Biologists, on the other hand, use this term as long as it's not applied to human. Another word for race is subspecies or ecotypes, and are defined as populations of species that are both geographically separated and differ genetically in one or more traits. There are many animals and plant races. In animals, there are many mice that have different coat color. In plants, they differ in in the shape of their leaves. So let's dive in. We know that Homo sapiens have races as well. Therefore, this tells us that we do not differ from evolved species. The fact that there are different races in humans suggests that our populations were geographically separated long enough to allow some genetic diversity to occur. There is yet not a clear line to show the divisions of races. Anthropologists have recognized from 3 to more than 30 races. And looking at it from a geneticist point of view, we can see that there is definitely not a clear line between the division of races because there are so many differences. Therefore, the genetic variation that we do know about is only what we can see because there is more genetic diversity than meets the eye. Over the last 3 decades, direct genetic evidence shows that about 10 to 15% of all genetic variation in humans is represented by differences between races that we can physically see, otherwise known as phenotypes. The remaining 85 to 90% occurs among individuals within races, but they have the same alleles, just that they are in different sequences. The most common example to talk is the ABO blood system. Almost all humans have these three alleles, but there is a difference in the frequencies that they appear in different groups. For example, the O allele is present 54% in Japanese, 64% in Finns, and 85% in Navajos. Some racial differences give us an idea of the evolutionary pressures that acted in different areas. For example, sickle cell anemia is common in blacks, whose ancestors came from equatorial Africa. Carriers of sickle cell mutation have resistance to malaria, a deadly disease. We can conclude that the high frequency of this mutation is a result of natural selection responding to the malaria disease. Because this mutation helps these Africans so that they can live and reproduce. There are also racial differences that are caused by adaptations to different environments. For example, the darker skin of tropical groups gives them protection from the UV light that could otherwise result to skin cancer. The light skin of higher altitude groups allows for penetration of light to make vitamin D, which is needed to prevent rickets and tuberculosis. Now, let's look at differences that have nothing to do with environment. If we take into account culture, which makes humans unique, we know that language, for example, allows us to speak our mind. It is also important to note that humans can change their culture faster than they can evolve genetically, but culture change can produce genetic change. Gene culture evolution is the idea that a change in cultural environment leads to new types of selections on genes. This makes the idea of sexual selection for physical differences especially appealing. Sexual selection can act very fast, making it the ideal candidate for fast evolution of physical traits. For example, let's say men have straight hair, but women start to find curly hair more attractive. This change in the cultural environment leads to new types of selections on genes. And therefore, over time, we will start because sexual selection acts on the and it's very fast, leading to the fast evolution of physical traits. What about race and behavioral differences? It is very hard to get data on this because it is hard to run valid experiments since they are usually considered unethical. For example, human infants would have to be removed and put into a different ethnicity from their parents in identical random environments. And then behavioral differences that would remain would be genetic. But we do know that cultural influences on behaviors are strong. Selection has not produced major differences between races. It has produced some intriguing differences between populations within ethnic groups. This shows that selection has acted recently. What happens when genes are no longer needed? Babies are able to produce the enzyme lactase, which breaks down sugars. Thanks to this enzyme, babies are able to drink milk. But as babies get older, they eventually stop producing lactase and become lactase intolerant because they can no longer drink milk. They can no longer break down the sugars. The disappearance of lactase is because natural selection kicked in. Since our ancestors did not drink milk as adults, selection intervened because there was no point in making this enzyme if they did not need it. Why waste energy on that? Continuing with the example of the lactose enzyme, let's look at culture. Some European countries are pastoralists, meaning that they raise cows, so therefore they have good source of milk. These human populations do produce lactase. The two alleles of the gene, tolerant and intolerant form are different by a single letter in the DNA code. The tolerant allele is high in the populations that have cows, whereas on the populations that depend on agriculture, the allele is low. Evidence shows that humans began to domesticate cows between 1700 and 1900 years ago in Sudan. From DNA sequencing, we can determine when the tolerant allele arose by mutation. This was between 3,000 and 8,000 years ago, which correlates to when pastoralism arose. DNA extracted from 7,000-year-old European skeleton showed that they were lactose intolerant, which is expected because they were not pastoral yet. This is a great example of genetic culture coevolution because we can see how culture affects our genes. Now we look at genes that were once destructive but are no longer so bad. And we can also look at genes that were once good but are no longer good. If we take the example from sickle cell anemia, yes, this is a bad mutation, but it comes with its benefit because it is resistant to malaria. There is also a mutant gene called CCR5 delta 32 that provides its carriers with strong protection against AIDS, which is also good. And when we look at genes that were once good and are no longer good, we can take the example of sugars. To our ancestors, this was a source that was rare to them. Therefore, when they had it, it was good for them because it was not constantly being fed to them to produce diseases that we now see thanks to the availability of sugars. Thanks to the availability of sugars, we now see diseases like obesity, diabetes, and even heart disease. Remember that so long as people die before they have stopped evolving, and so long as some people leave more offspring than others, there is opportunity for natural selection to improve us. If genetic variation affects our ability to survive and reproduce, natural selection will be there to promote evolutionary change and benefit us.
The evidence supporting evolution can make anyone question what they already know to be true. But why does it fail to convince some people? People don't seem to argue the existence of black holes or electrons. Why is evolution so different? Some people don't care how much evidence is presented. They will still believe otherwise. They reject evolution because of the consequences they believe will come about. Some just find it easier to reject evolution and continue believing in whatever makes them feel safe or special. Ultimately, supernatural explanations don't allow for questioning. Things happen only because God wants it to happen, so don't even bother asking questions. That's borderline crazy. Lightning doesn't come from Zeus. It comes from a collection of overcharged electrons. Locusts aren't sent from God out of spite to destroy crops. Locusts just overcrowd areas and begin breeding rapidly to the increase of serotonin. Science is never satisfied and demands to be scrutinized to uncover the truth.
If we want to understand a naturalistic view of ethics, we can look at an interpretation done by Philosophy Lander, who believes a theory of moral behavior according to which ethics is an empirical science. Ethical statements are reduced to the natural sciences, such as physical or social, and ethical questions are answered wholly on the basis of the findings of those sciences. In order to drive opposition towards Darwinian roots, Tom DeLay tried to portray evolution as a negative. In the book The Selfish Gene, written by Richard Dawkins, he tries to explore the selfish gene as a metaphor for how natural selection works. He states that genes act as if they're selfish molecules, those that produce better adaptation, act as they're elbowing out other genes in the battle for future existence. Selfish genes can produce selfish behaviors, but there are ways that evolution can favor genes that lead to cooperation, altruism, and even morality. Then there's the other side of the spectrum, the cooperative gene. And evolutionary psychology, according to William A. Springs, evolutionary psychology is the science that seeks to explain through universal mechanisms of behavior why humans act the way they do.
There are behaviors that are seen as adaptations. It is important to note that a behavior is a variable of time and space. Behaviors that we see in our surroundings, like society. There are different types of behaviors, but there are a few behaviors that are absolute and inflexible, like sleep and language and even eating. There were some behaviors that were adaptive to our ancestors that are no longer so good for us today. Other behaviors are genetic adaptations. Behaviors that are sometimes seen as adaptations. The problem is that we know nothing about the evolution of these behaviors. The most prominent example is the evolution of our sense of morality. There is no real evidence to support how this happened. There are modern thinkers that create theories of how this might have happened, but all these theories go down the drain because they cannot be tested. In order to validate any ideas of how this might have evolved, we need to go through many experiments to test these predictions, like we do with non-human animals. Our behavior, in part, may be genetically encoded, implanted by natural selection. Mutations bring change. Environmental factors can affect the expression of genes. This can bring us to the concept of nature versus nurture, where we can see, for example, a child. If he is brought up in a place where he has a good childhood, good care, versus where he's brought up in an orphanage where he's neglected, he will have different behaviors, and this is proven fact. The morality changes that we are seeing today are not caused by evolution because they are happening too fast to be caused by our genes. Our genetic heritage is not fixed because, as we can see, we are changing very fast, from sacrificing animals and people to producing laws to protect animals from cruelty. Evolution tells us where we came from, not where we are going.
Are humans still evolving? Lactose intolerance and wisdom teeth are some good examples to show that we are indeed still evolving. Mutations that kept the lactose gene switched on are common in modern European humans, but not in our African ancestors. The ability to drink milk was advantageous, so natural selection favored the individual carrying this lactose tolerance. So today, due to the convergent evolution of African and European populations, many people can enjoy milk at any age. Early hominids were equipped with an arsenal of teeth, including the wisdom teeth. These extra teeth helped when trying to chew hard foods. But as prehistoric man evolved, the wisdom teeth weren't so important anymore because of the ability to soften food by cooking it. So as the brains became larger and the jaws became smaller, it resulted in humans having to get these vestigial teeth removed.